So we'll have 3 talks by CSE fellows. Our first talk will be by Jeff Curtis from the Department of Atmospheric Sciences. The title of the talk is Parallel Stochastic Particle Method Development for Atmospheric Aerosol Model.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the project that I'm working on regarding the parallel stochastic particle methods for atmospheric aerosol modeling. I'm Jeff Curtis, and my advisors are Nicole Reimer from the Department of Atmospheric Science and Matthew West from Mechanical Science and Engineering. First off, I wanted to define atmospheric aerosols. So an aerosol is defined as a solid, liquid, or mixed-phase particle suspended in the atmosphere. Okay, so here I have some images of what these aerosols may look like in the atmosphere. And the important thing here is these particles consist of various different chemical compounds due to coagulation processes where 2 particles collide, and also condensation of gases. So, so we have these complex structures where we have ammonium sulfate and dust and soot, and these can all coexist within one aerosol particle. So, why are these aerosols of particular interest? There's like 3 major reasons why aerosols are relatively important. One of the reasons is the health impact. Here in this image here, we see this woman walking down the street, and this haze is the aerosol particles, and breathing this in, has been linked to respiratory distress. And also we have aerosols can scatter or absorb solar radiation based on their composition and size. And also there's interactions with clouds. Aerosols act as seed particles for rain formation. So these 2 are of particular interest for global climate change. So it's important to understand aerosols. Okay, so a little bit about atmospheric modeling. Atmospheric modeling ranges a whole wide span of sizes. We have things that are occurring on the molecular scale, things on the particle scale, which is like nanometers to micrometers, which I'll be talking about today. And then we have these scales that all fill in, the mesoscale and regional scale, which is on the order of like tens of kilometers. And then finally to a global scale. So there's real difficulty here. In a global scale model, we can't represent all these small scale processes. But we hope to parameterize them in a way that will still get the answer right. So we have to look at these particles and understand them in order to do that well. So, introduction to my project. My project goal was to develop a particle resolved aerosol model that also has full transport. So we have a spatial distribution of these particles. So on the left here, we have a model that I'm using, PartMC. It's a particle resolved Monte Carlo model. It's a box model, and we have all this wonderful information regarding size and composition. However, since it's a box model, we have no spatial resolution. On the right here, we have the sort of the regional weather model of choice these days. Has a very large developing community. It's the WRF model, and in the WRF model, we can resolve the dynamics of the atmosphere. So here in this image here, we have a bulk quantity that's just like a mass concentration of a certain species. And then on the left here, we have all this detail regarding size and composition of particles. So the real benefit of this project is I'm going to take the 2 weaknesses of these models and sort of combine them so we avoid those problems. However, as you can imagine, particle resolved modeling is very expensive. So one, how do we accomplish this? And more importantly, how can we actually do this in an efficient manner? Okay, so the concept is, on the left here, we have basically like a particle flow field. And then I've highlighted out a certain little region here. So on the left here, we can see all the particles look the same from this distance. When we zoom in, we can see that particles are very different. They're going to interact in different ways, and their composition is different. So what we do is we are going to model coagulation by the probability of two particles interacting, and then gas to particle conversion is a deterministic process. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually ignore position within these boxes and just represent the aerosols by this, where we have the location at x with composition mu and at time t. So here is the model equation. So the size distribution changes based on obviously transport. So if particles are being transported to that spot, we're going to change the distribution. And then there's the coagulation gain and loss. So when two particles coagulate, one larger particle is created and two particles are destroyed. Obviously emissions, and then we also have chemistry, where we have gases condensing or evaporating off the particle, and finally air density changes. So how do we go about representing those in weather models? So as I've mentioned previously, one of the challenges is that particle sizes span 3 orders of magnitude and can be composed of a wide variety of chemical species. And also, to complicate the problem, all these things are constantly changing. So on the left here, the two left images here are typical ways that atmospheric models currently represent their aerosols. One popular way is a modal approach, where you represent the distribution of the sum of modes. This is particularly appealing because it's very computationally efficient. A little more, much more accurate, but much more expensive is this idea of sectional modeling, where it stores number and or mass in each aerosol bin. However, in each bin, every particle will have the same size and the same composition. So we're making an assumption there. And on the right here, we have a particle resolved model where we can easily represent very complex mixtures. So particles can be the same size but have drastically different compositions. So how do we do that? Here's a schematic of how PartMC represents particles. So over here on the left here, I have the particle field from before. Picked 3 particles. We've taken these 3 particles and we put them in a vector space where we have black carbon, sulfate, and organic carbon. And basically we can represent the constituent masses in this vector space. So this is very convenient in comparison to other ways of representing the data. And this is why. So here I have a true solution, a modal solution, a finite volume solution, which is equivalent to the sectional solution, and then a particle solution. So the major advantage of this particle representation is what we like to call is it breaks the curse of dimensionality. In the particle resolved model, our calculation scales with the number of particles rather than the number of species. So say in the WRF model, there's a sectional model, and it consists of 8 size bins. And if they were to represent the number of species that our model represents, where A is the number of species, it would be 8 to the 20th. Now, obviously, for memory reasons, that is not feasible. So with this particle model, our storage is going to scale based on just the number of particles. You can use 1,000 or you can use 100,000, but it's still significantly going to be less than 8 to the 20. So what actual weather models do is they're going to project all these things down to a series of one-dimensional distributions. Okay, so the benefits of the stochastic processes in the model. One such interaction is particle coagulation. That's when 2 particles are going to collide. So if we have n particles, there's n squared pairs of coagulation events. So if we were to naively do this, we'd compute the probabilities of each of those particles coagulating with others, and then test all those events. However, in actuality, particle coagulation is heavily dependent on particle diameter. So we can actually do a much more efficient way where we stochastically sample based on the number of expected events and then reject those coagulation events. So we go from n squared calculations to just the number of coagulation events expected. And then also with particle transport, naively, we could actually track all the particles, all the particles in the atmosphere could have a position in space, and we can update them each time step. In actuality, we're going to ignore the particle location within a grid cell, and then we'll stochastically sample the number of the number of particles that should be transported from one grid cell to another. Okay, just to briefly touch upon sort of how we make this more computationally feasible. On the left here, I have okay, so my model right now is just a vertical column model, the vertical column being the most atmospherically interesting. This is why we chose to do that. So here I have 4 grid cells, and I've subdivided them across 4 processors in space. However, with the particle populations, we can actually distribute the particle population amongst many processors. So we can actually apply many processors to a single grid cell, which is really an interesting aspect in comparison to what a weather model currently would be doing. Okay, and finally, I have a brief example of sort of the benefits of the result that we end up getting. So on the left here, let's see here. I have it right here. Okay, so on the left, vertically, we have what we call black carbon mass fraction. And this is the mass of black carbon in a particle divided by the total mass in the particle. So this is basically showing how much black carbon is in a particle. And black carbon is of particular interest because it has, it absorbs solar radiation, and it also dislikes water. So the less black carbon in a particle, the more likely it can act as a CCN. The more BC mass fraction in a particle, the more likely it's going to absorb solar radiation and cause warming. So, and then on the bottom here we have just the particle dry diameter. So on the left here I have 3 different vertical levels in my model, and we have lots of information. So if we take a particle that's 10 to the minus 1 micrometers, we can see that we have many different compositions. However, what I can do with the particle resolve data is actually I can first compositionally average it and then size average it, and then that ends up being sort of the result that a normal sectional model would give us. So okay, so like right here we have this point, which is sort of representative. It's representative of this diameter here. If we go over here, we have all this information regarding the particle composition at that given size. And this has many ramifications, especially regarding radiative balance. Okay, and just to conclude, I wanted to discuss the applications of the model and some of the future work. As a result of this model, we now have multi-dimensional aerosol size distribution that's now spatially resolved. So we've taken the box model and gone beyond the box. And it may be applied to conducting detailed studies on particle scale to study what we call particle aging. That's particle aging is how these black carbon particles, how they evolve in time due to processes such as coagulation and condensation, which drastically changes their optical properties. Another result is we can use this model to benchmark against more approximate aerosol models. We can compare it to current state-of-the-art sectional models. And also, the most interesting to me personally is quantifying the error introduced in atmospheric models due to the assumptions regarding the particle size and composition. So we can take this particle resolve data and compare it against model output from a sectional model, and we can see how we can actually quantify that error that's been in models and hasn't been previously quantified. And then in terms of future model development, like I mentioned earlier, we can incorporate the use of a group of processors to simulate a single grid cell's population. So we can, instead of maybe 10,000 particles, we could use 100,000 particles and distribute them on 10 processors if we have the computing resources available. And then we would like to extend this model to 3D. which increases the computational burden from approximately maybe 100 grid cells to the order of millions to properly represent the domain of a field campaign per se. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
All right, in the interest of time, unless there are really pressing questions, let's move on to the second speaker, who will be Abhishek Singh from the Department of